and co-instructed for the Mussel Identification Workshop of Missouri team events. All right, here she is right here.
Thank you very much. So, mussels. A lot of people, when they hear the word mussels, they think this. So, and that's spelled differently, even though it's a mussel. We have lots of those. Mussels in this case are actually shells, or animals that have shells. And just so we don't get too confused with the mussels that we get at the store, and these are the ones that you get in restaurants, and you can eat these with garlic. These are mussels, but these are not the ones that I am going to talk about here. A lot of times people think mussels are clams. Clams can be like these that come from the ocean. So it's easy to call mussels clams, and that's okay too. It's not, you know, a big deal to say that they're clams. Most people call them pearly mussels because of the interior of the shells are actually very pearly and really pretty. What got me started in mussels was a friend of mine. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri. She and her sister did extensive collecting in rivers and streams all over the United States, mostly in the eastern part of the U.S. She heard me say something about freshwater mussels just in passing, and she said, "Oh, you got to do this. You got to learn about mussels because they're really cool." And I thought, no, they all look alike. I thought in Kansas there were only maybe 5 or 6 different kinds, and it's like, I'm not going to do that. So she kind of convinced me a little at a time. I went out and got some mussels out of a stream and realized how interesting they are. They're really, really cool. The shells are really interesting. The whole life cycle of a mussel is really interesting. And in that process, she taught me how to identify them. I found out that there were not, at the time, very many books on freshwater mussel identification. So I went ahead and filled the gap at the time and wrote this book. It took me 3 years, and I published it in 1997. So it was something that kind of spearheaded a lot of other books that have come out by different people since. I illustrated it because my photography is not very good, so I went ahead and just did the illustrations too. And it's been a really useful book. I learned a lot. I learned an enormous amount about freshwater mussels. So backing up just a little bit, what exactly is a mussel? It is a 2-shelled mollusk that lives in fresh water. They'll live in rivers, streams, ponds, lakes. Any place where there's a permanent body of water, you can find mussels. Mussels are found all over the world, everywhere except Antarctica. That's the only place you won't find them. They live in a variety of different substrates. And by substrate, I mean like mud, sand, gravel, combinations of that. The only thing they can't live in is sand that shifts a lot. So they need to be able to stay in one place pretty much or move around just a little. So they won't live in places where the sand is really, really moving a lot. Or if there's places where the water is not permanently running most of the time. So what we have is this poster demonstrates just a few of the examples of the varieties of different mussels that are found in the United States. There's about 300 different species of freshwater mussels just in North America alone. A lot of those are endangered because of problems with the water, problems with siltation and chemical runoff and a lot of different things. So there's been a lot of decimation of mussel populations because of things like that. And people think, well, what good's a mussel? Why do we care? Why do we, they're out of sight, out of mind. What good are they? And this little poster was something I had put together for a workshop. And what it says there, reasons why it is important to have healthy, sizable mussel populations in streams and rivers. saying they are extremely sensitive indicators of stream health. And they're living bioassayers, or they're the canary in the coal mine of the environment. They're the aquatic equivalent to that canary in the coal mine. What affects them ultimately affects us because we drink water. They also filter and cleanse the water. They can improve lake, stream, water quality. They also provide food for various types of fish, birds, and different kinds of mammals like raccoons and muskrats and things like that. And it's something that we found when I would go out and do a lot of the stream sampling and collecting out in the streams. I would hear this over and over again. If you really want to find a rare mussel, find where a muskrat has piled up a bunch of shells and eaten what was in the shells. And then you'll find some of the rare stuff around in those muskrat middens, which is really interesting. How they find them and people can't, I don't know. Something else that mussels have provided throughout history is they have been a food source for Native Americans. They, I don't know if they taste all that good, but when you're in a pinch and you need to eat, they're probably okay. They can get a person by. In some places there are massive amounts of shells that the Native Americans had collected and eaten the interior of the mollusk, and left these huge shell middens that have been from people. People can go in and look at, dig that out and look in there and see what used to be around, just based on what the Native Americans had left behind. Something more recently that mussels have been used for are in 1890, there was a man in Iowa that figured out that mussels can be made into buttons. So a big industry started in Muscatine, Iowa, up and down the Mississippi River, and even some places in Kansas, there were button factories where people would go out and collect the shells, and they would cut the shells and make mother-of-pearl buttons out of these shells. So you have, even the small ones were used, even really small ones. Even if they only got 2 buttons out of the one shell, they would punch it. And so the button industry lasted from the 1890s up until the 1950s. These are the way they would be packaged and sold in stores or sold on clothing and things like that. Up until in the 1950s, when it was decided that plastic can be made to look like mother of pearl, and plastic was easier, probably less expensive to process. So plastic replaced the buttons of mother of pearl, of shell. So they no longer fished the mussels out of the rivers for button manufacturing. Some of the other things that people would do with shells is they would make them into these cute little souvenirs the chain is missing on these, but these are little antique shell purses. This one had been from Niagara Falls. This one was from Saratoga Springs. And they would make these into cute little purses and put this stuff on the inside to make a little coin purse or a sewing purse or something. You can find these in antique shops. So this was from about the late 1800s until about the 1930s that people would do these. The local people in various cultures will take mussel shell and use it to make jewelry. This is a mussel shell necklace from South America that someone had used. I think it was Peru, I believe, Peruvian Amazon. So there's that. And then I'm going to step over here for just a second. This is an Aboriginal shell necklace from Papua New Guinea. That's kind of a nice sound to it. But these are all mussel shells that had been had a hole put in them, and that was worn that way. So you hear that person coming from quite a ways away. This is a hat from the Congo, Africa, that actually has mussel shells kind of sewn onto it. So it was kind of a little thing there. So people would find different things to use the mussel shells for. Now, nowadays, people don't really do as much with them, except for the fact that mussels are still fished in some places for the cultured pearl industry. So what happens is the really, really thick-shelled mussels, which I don't have one, well, this one's a little bit, this might be thick enough. The really thick-shelled mussels are harvested under permits and regulations and all kinds of things to cut these into beads that are placed into the marine oyster, and that's how they start cultured pearls, is they'll take a marine oyster and seed it with this stuff. And this is the best stuff. They can't find anything else that works as well. And there was a nice Japanese man named Mikimoto, you've probably heard of Mikimoto pearls, who actually figured out how to do that. The ones who have, the shells who have the purple interiors can't be used for that because the coating of the pearl that the pearl oyster puts over that is so thin you could actually see the purple underneath. So they don't want purple, they want white. So it's kind of one of those things, and it's regulated, and so I think in Kansas it is still, if there had been a halt put on the harvest of freshwater mussels for the pearl industry. So I don't know what the status is on that lately, but they had put a stop on it because of all of the over-harvesting and poaching that was going on. People were going in without permits. So some of these mussels have some really interesting names. This one is called a pink heel splitter. And you can see why, because the mussel lives in the mud or the gravel in the river, positioned about like this. So somebody, and there's about this much of it showing. So if a person walks through there and steps on that could hurt their foot. So this one is called a deer toe. You can kind of see why. It looks a little bit like a footprint of a deer. They have a lot of different names. Some of these I don't know why they call them what they do. This one's called a spectacle case. This one comes from Missouri. And so it looks like a little glasses case. And this is the Neosho Muppet, which is kind of plain looking, but this particular mussel is on the federal endangered species list now. It only comes from a very small area of Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, just right in that little place where the 4 states come together. So it's kind of limited, so it's been protected by law. And this one's called a flat floater because it has a very lightweight in shell. And it lives in mud because if it were anywhere else, it might not do so well. They like mud. Live in mud. This mussel is actually from China. And China has quite a variety of freshwater mussels too, as do a lot of places. This is a big mussel from the Yangtze River Basin in China. This one's called a 3-horned wartyback because it has 3 bumps on it right there. That's kind of cool. So a lot of these are from Kansas except the ones I mentioned. So the thing that I get asked a lot about mussels is, what about zebra mussels? Because a lot of people have heard of those now. Zebra mussels were accidentally introduced into the United States. They came in water that got dumped in from ships into the Great Lakes. They got established a lot of places, including Kansas now. They're in Kansas. So in Pomona Lake especially, I was there a few weeks ago and saw zebra mussels washed up on the shores of Pomona Lake. This is what they do. This mussel is actually from one of the Great Lakes. So I'll show you what happens. Zebra mussels are not your nice kind of mussel. They can multiplied very quickly. So there's a freshwater mussel like one of these right down in here. You can see there it is. It's of course no longer has the animal in it. Zebra mussels will attach onto that part that sticks up out of the bed of the river. They will attach and attach and attach until they make this kind of stuff, all stacked up. Then this mussel has limited access to food because these guys are taking all of it. And it can actually get to the point where the mussel cannot even open its own shell. So this has been a real problem. Zebra mussels also clog pipes. They travel on boats. They travel a lot of places where you think they couldn't survive, but they do. All they need to do is stay wet, so they can go from lake to lake or stream to stream or whatever. And so that's the kind of problem. They get into the intake pipes of power plants, and they have to be cleaned off every so often because they clog everything. They're just a mess. So that's kind of one of those things where it's unfortunate that it happened, and now there's not a whole lot that can be done about it except prevent the spread of the zebra mussels. Something else that people wonder about is what if it's a mussel is, and I'll show you a picture of it in the book, is the little Asian clam, which I know you've probably seen this one. It's not this big, it's only about that big, it's real small. But you'll see these on the lake shores in a lot of places. This was also introduced. A lot of people will go out and collect those and make them into soup or something like that. I've never done that, I don't know what they taste like, but they're kind of a little bit of a nuisance. They don't do what a zebra mussel does, but they do sometimes compete with the local population. So that's kind of in a nutshell, things about freshwater mussels, why they're interesting, and why should we care? Because they're really pretty cool. They have one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, is they need a fish to reproduce. What they do is the female mussel will have fertilized eggs, but she needs to get those onto a fish in order for them to develop the rest of the way and become little baby mussels. How does she do that? They have different little things that they can do. One of them that's the most stunning is they can actually have on the outside of this is called their mantle. They have an extension on the squishy part of their mantle that looks like a fish. And so that attracts, and they'll twitch it and everything to make it look real. That attracts a bass or some other fish that would eat something like this to come down and check it out. When they do, she releases all of these hundreds of little undeveloped mussel babies into that fish's gills, because that's where they need to be. It doesn't hurt the fish, but what they do is they stay there for a little while, change into tiny mussels, and then drop off, and then they can grow and become big mussels. So that's pretty cool. They also have different, there's some that look like aquatic insects. There's some that look like crayfish, the lures. There's some that will spread like the flat floater mussel there. It lives in real quiet water where there's not much movement. They will spread out this thing that looks like an underwater cobweb that fish swim through that has the little baby mussels in it. So that's pretty cool. It's been studied a lot because a lot of people want to know which fish goes with what mussel, because some mussels can use a lot of different fish and other mussels can only use maybe one or two. So if the fish is gone, then the mussel disappears too. So there's a big conservation effort in finding out what fish host a certain mussel, especially an endangered one, uses to go ahead and complete that life cycle. So there's been so much research done, and it has been so fascinating. They find out all the different ways these mussels do things to get that fish involved. So that's kind of, I've got some little cards with a button for everybody. And I also, let me step back here, and I have a little topic guide for everybody who wants a topic guide that is for, yeah, we can hand those out. Yeah. I will pass the box around, and you can take one out of there and just pass it on through. Anybody who has questions,
Yes,
go
thank
for
you.
it. Yes. Do you think maybe they're the little Asian clams?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, yeah, they're pretty common, so they're in a lot of places. I've seen them just, Olathe Lake has them in there along with a few of the freshwater mussels in there, so they're pretty easy to find. So, yeah, yes.
Why would they, why couldn't they still use mother of pearl when they found plastic?
For buttons.
For buttons? I think it was because it was easier to manufacture and it was a lot less expensive than to go out and to do all this, to try to keep up with it. Anybody else? Okay. But you're welcome to come up and look, have a closer look at the shells and you know, kind of see what all the different shapes and colors are, and enjoy the little booklets and the cards. I think you'll get a lot of fun with those.
Those of you who are ready for snacks, can you go wash your hands